That's great. Thank you very much, Alex, for the introduction. Thank you very much all for coming. It's I find it hard to express how happy I am to be at the University of Edinburgh in this taking up this new appointment. So yeah, thank you very much for everyone for welcoming me in the university and giving support over the past few weeks. So when the first Brazilian universities were created in the 1930s and 40s, its professors were recruited from amongst the existing literary academies, scientific institutes, faculties of law and medicine, prestigious secondary schools, and seminaries abroad. Although Protestants still represented a tiny religious minority in the country then, a considerable number of evangelical ministers and writers were appointed to prestigious positions in these emerging universities, including people such as Antônio Mota, Teodoro Maure Jr., and Alceu Renan Araújo. Protestant scholars took up chairs notably in the fields of linguistics and philology, continuing the work of predecessors such as the President Minister and grammarian Eduardo Campos Pereira in the last decade. We'll come back again to these names, so we don't have to worry too much. These ministers and scholars demonstrated the close interest in folklore and rural variations of Portuguese language amongst the Caipira populations of central and southeastern Brazil. As linguists and grammarians, they systematized different expressions of Caipira Portuguese, they examined the history and structure of such linguistic variations. So in this presentation today, I will examine two interrelated processes leading up to this evangelical scholarly interest in Caipira culture and customs. It was amongst the Caipiras, the regions of São Paulo and Minas Gerais, that evangelical Christianity first made headways in Brazil, mostly through the leadership of local agents such as evangelists, school teachers, and Bible vendors, those so-called co-workers. The first part of the presentation will examine how the Caipiras engaged with beliefs and practices of evangelical religion and evaluate the responses of two generations of Caipira converts to new religious practices and ideas. Also, this paper will consider how Protestant scholars transform Caipira culture and language into an object of analysis, examining their customs and language in the first half of the 20th century. So the first question is, who the Caipiras are? So yeah, the Caipiras are a mixed race rural people occupying a vast area encompassing the states of central, southeastern, and portions of central western Brazil. So the region in red here is where the Caipira world stretches. They are usually depicted as a population of indigenous and white European descent, but attempts to draw out racial typology have long been deemed as problematic for the case of the Caipiras. In the Anglophone academic literature, the Caipiras are usually translated as the Brazilian hillbillies or bumpkins, a rural people of unsophisticated manners and ungrammatical language who stand as a stark contrast to the educated urban and coastal elites and middle classes. For historians and social scientists such as Antônio Cândido and Maria Silvia de Carvalho Franco, what distinguished the Caipiras of São Paulo were their social and cultural characteristics, not their racial traits. In the context of the coffee boom of the 19th and 20th century, the Caipiras were the free and poor rural laborers in the society largely dominated by powerful landowners deploying slave owners. So these are some of the most beautiful artistic representations of the Caipira that I found. These are paintings from a famous 19th century Brazilian painter called Almeida Jr. And they capture quite, accurately the general poverty and rusticity of the Caipira, especially the first image, Caipira become the fumo. The second image, if you live from 1899, also captures sociability that predominates in the festive culture that predominates amongst the Caipiras. But these were not the most popular representations of the Caipiras. These were produced for the literary work of a famous Brazilian writer called Monteiro Lobato. And this, and Monteiro Lobato wrote a series of tracts, books on, and tales also on a figure he called the Jeca Tatu, was for him the embodiment of the Caipira, right? So the Jeca Tatu was the stereotypical representation of the Caipira. Lazy, uneducated, lacking in ambition and energy, plagued by vermin and diseases and alcoholism. For historian Daim Borges from the University of Chicago, the Caipira of Monteiro Lobato's literary work embodied the idea of degeneration in Brazilian social thought. It was the degenerate par excellence. It was amongst the Caipira populations of São Paulo and Minas Gerais that evangelical Christianity first made extensive and sustained inroads in Brazil. These were the regions that attracted the majority of foreign American Protestant missionaries in the 90s. Initially, the missionaries started with communities of English and American migrants and merchants in Brazil, especially the thousands of Confederate families fleeing the Civil War in the United States that settled the countryside of São Paulo. So we're talking about these areas, northern São Paulo, southern and western Minas Gerais, right? These were the areas where evangelical Christianity first made inroads in Brazil. For Presbyterians and Methodist missionaries, these communities of immigrants provided something like a doorstep into the thriving rural world of southeastern Brazil. The first efforts of American Presbyterian missionaries in this region date from 1861, when the competent but authoritarian Alexander Blackford first established a mission station in the city of São Paulo. Well, in tune with missionary strategies deployed in other parts of Brazil, the Presbyterians started to organize regular services, Bible study sessions, and offer primary education through Sunday and parent schools. However, the local population soon began to take on the evangelical message of individual salvation and disseminate it. Small armies of local evangelists, school teachers, and booksellers established preaching places and small congregations in improvised rooms, the houses of converts, and to conduct religious services regularly. The new religion spread quickly in these areas. In 1888, when the National Presbyterian Synod of Brazil was created, there were 61 Presbyterian congregations located in 12 of the 20 Brazilian provinces, comprising approximately 3,000 communicant members. 43 of these 61 congregations were located in the regions of São Paulo and Minas Gerais. Apart from these churches, there were dozens of other preaching places falling under the remit of local congregations and whose services and activities were entirely organized by local convert families. Historians and social scientists, and even theologians, have relied on functionalist explanations to account for this early history of evangelical growth in central and southeastern Brazil. Scholars such as Ronald Fraisse and Antonio Gouveia Mendonça related evangelical diffusion through a series of economic and demographic transformations that took place in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, such as the abolition of slavery, urbanization, and the overthrow of the Brazilian Empire with its secularizing consequences. For Mendonça, the religious practices introduced by Protestants were more easily adaptable to the mobile and impoverished caipiras of the agricultural talking frontier. Because the caipiras led semi-nomadic life, the Catholic Church found it difficult to operate its bureaucratic machinery in this mobile and unstable setting, leaving much room for Protestant evangelists. And in Ronald Fraisse's argument, the institutional arrangements of the congregations and missionary schools legitimized the aspirations of emergent social categories seeking some degree of social participation. The electoral and republican systems of Presbyterian and Congregationalist churches and the modernizing educational approaches of Protestant schools were particularly attractive to the people of the middling sort in cities and the countryside. Although I take no aim at these approaches, my analysis shifts away from such broad social transformations that lay the groundwork for process of religious change to the actual interactions, dialogues, practices implicated in conversion experiences. In autobiographies and conversion narratives, first-generation believers often represented their conversion to Protestantism as, quote, break with the religion of my parents. In the process, long-held Catholic devotions yielded to a new religious subjectivity that conceived the veneration of the Virgin, saints, and religious icons as the fruits of spiritual corruption and priestly despotism. One of the most dramatic stages of the process of religious change occurred when converts got rid of their statues and images of saints by either burning them or throwing them to a river. After conversion, believers found the Catholic festivals and processions they previously cherished to be utterly repugnant and abhorrent, gradually adopting an austere behavior. But believers did not depict conversion as the turn to a new religion. Instead, they claim to recover the gospel in its pristine purity, what historians of the Pentecostal movement suggest when David Maxwell, the primitivist impulse. They broke away from the religion of their worldly parents to embrace the religion of their spiritual parents, the apostolic community of the New Testament. In this sense, Brazilian believers conceptualize conversion not as a movement of rupture, of renewal, of innovation, but purification. Scholars have emphasized that this break with the established religion had an important impact on the social life of converts. The idea of individual conversion, held by Protestants, destabilized the position of believers within their local communities. In the words of historian Richard Graham, one of the main contributions of foreign Protestant missionaries to the modernization of Brazil was the emphasis placed upon the individual. I quote him: once people began to think of themselves as independent units rather than as parts of a larger whole in which their place was permanently fixed, the breakdown of traditional society was imminent, unquote. This evangelical conception of the self dissolved the vertical social bonds that characterized relations of patronage in the Brazilian countryside, with significant consequences for believers. In rural Brazil, customary obligations of protection and sponsorship contracted in baptisms and marriages created vast networks of compadrio or co-parenthood that were decisive for the making or breaking of an individual's life and career. First-generation converts, however, did not accept the idea of godfathers or godmothers. Inspired by the doctrines of the sufficiency of Christ's sacrifice, evangelical pastors urged believers to reject the notion that both saints and godparents served as spiritual and social intermediaries. The Presbyterian school teacher, Maria de Melo Chaves, writing about the conversion of her family in the countryside of Minas Gerais, registered the perplexity of her kin and neighbors with this. Her uncle, Davi Melo, was the first convert in a small village called Carmo da Bagagem in western Minas Gerais. When his brother, Manuel de Melo, invited Davi to be the best man or padrinho in his wedding in 1897, Davi accepted it only partially, saying he would happily stand by his brother's side in the civil ceremony, but not at a Catholic parish. Manuel's shocked. My brother won't be my best man. When Maria was born a few years later, already into a convert family, the Brazilian Presbyterian pastor celebrated her baptism, and the Catholic neighbors who attended the ceremony quickly noticed the absence of godparents, padrinhos, from the Portuguese word for both best man and godparents is padrinhos, or madrinhos. Amongst Presbyterians, the baptism of infants implicated the nuclear family into a commitment to instruct the children in the basic principles of Christian religion, but left the extended family out of such obligations, with individuating consequences for first-generation converts. Religious change, however, did not entail a wholesale rejection of established social and cultural norms and customs. Brazilian evangelicals developed a selective response to custom, and their selectivity can be observed in their attitudes towards the festive culture of the rural countryside. The strictures of the Protestant ethic led converts to disapprove of community festivals and their rejection of Catholicism, and they the repudiation of celebration of days of patron saints. Converts did not tolerate the occasions of excessive drinking and violence afforded by much of these rural festivals. In this respect, the elder of the Presbyterian Church of Boa Vista do Jacaré, in São Paulo, Francisco Lopes Ribeiro, was the embodiment of Protestant rigor. His biographer, Reverend called Presbyterian Pastor Fulano de Gouveia, claimed that Francisco Lopes was an overzealous, even impertinent believer. For him, converts did not need the revelries of the world to amuse their spirits. Entertainments such as balls, cateretes is sort of indigenous dance, horse races, and the excesses of rural parties drowned in alcohol greatly horrified Francisco Lopes. End of quote. However, Protestants did take part in other rural festivities and mobilizations. First generation converts attended village marriages and believed that wedding ceremonies afforded them opportunity to evangelize the extended kin of the married couple. Henrique Gomes, another elder of Francisco Lopes' rural congregation in the countryside of São Paulo, was regarded as a highly respectable man in his village. And one of the indicators of Gomes' social standing was that he was invited to the intimate parties and weddings of his village. Believers also took part in mutirões, which were collective mobilizations of family members and neighbors to support agricultural work on the land of a small farmer, a constitutive part of the form of sociability in the Brazilian countryside. More significantly, evangelical conversion was a process that evolved amidst traditional forms of sociability in Brazil. In the Caipira zone, encompassing São Paulo and Minas Gerais, where the rhythms of life were governed by the cycles of sowing and harvest, small farmers and rural workers gathered the properties of neighbors and family members on occasions of collective labor and leisure. Protestant writers registered with the hint of nostalgia that an informal conversational climate predominated in such gatherings, in which Caipira men and women exchanged stories around the fire or on the table over meals. In 1921, the then Presbyterian folklorist and writer Cornélio Pires wrote that fire was the meeting point, the club of the Caipiras, their utmost form of sociability. On almost all narratives, conversion processes started around such intimate interactions. The Reverend Eduardo Carlos Pereira, very influential Presbyterian pastor in 19th and 20th century Brazil, wrote a series of tracts in the 1880s, exemplifying the ways in which local evangelists preached the beliefs and doctrines of evangelical Christianity to the rural families of the interior. In these tracts, itinerant preachers traveling across southern Minas Gerais engaged in a close and friendly conversation over dinner with the rural families who welcomed the evangelists in their huts. Conversion was the outcome of a conversation that took place in the domestic intimacy of rural families, a transformation that was carried out amidst long-established forms of sociability. The powers of persuasion and rhetoric were deeply enmeshed in this communication between evangelists and their audiences. Protestant evangelists drew images from the natural world and everyday life to anchor tenets and practices of evangelical religion into Brazilian culture. For instance, while the standard biblical imagery against idleness involved the image of hardworking ant, Brazilian converts and foreign missionaries found an even more promising correlate in the João de Barra, or the red oven. I mean, I know you are all well-traveled cosmopolitan people who are very fond of David Attenborough's BBC documentaries, but in case I haven't seen João de Barra or red oven, yeah, this is one. The bird labored tirelessly to build its oven-shaped clay nest. But another set of moral and behavioral values were associated with it. The bird was notoriously known for its monogamous instincts, forming a lasting bond with its pair. And in the local imagination, the bird rested on Sundays. The João de Barro was simultaneously set as an example of industry, religious observance, and stable marital relationships. The everyday life of work and leisure also offered opportunities for evangelical preachers. So according to Maria Chaves, the American Presbyterian missionary Robert Duffy had a relaxed, spontaneous temperament that was very pleasing to the sertanejos of backlanders of Minas Gerais. During a mutirão of these collective mobilizations to work the land, Duffy seized the board with corn seeds and began to recite the parable of the sower while planting the seeds in the furrows, readily captivating the attention of the other rural workers, some of whom converted later. So Protestant missionaries, ministers, and local converts engaged closely with local religious idioms and cultural imagery, locating the values and practices of evangelical religion into multiple historical, natural, and linguistic landscapes. Through its complex and ambiguous relationship with established forms of sociability, local customs, and nature, they were able to construe evangelical Christianity as a religion that was simultaneously transformative and adaptable, modernizing and conservative, or global and local, if you wish. For the first Caipira evangelicals, conversion was a process that isolated them from established networks of patronage and extended kin. The moral and behavioral demands implicated in the making of an evangelical persona drew them away from socialization in bars and religious festivals, with important consequences for class formation. Their offspring, however, did not experience conversion as a break with the religion of their parents. So, second-generation believers introduced some important modifications to the dynamics of evangelical conversion in rural Brazil. First, they did not experience religious change or rupture with the cultural world of their parents, and did not envision their old lives social and cultural entities that demanded purification. Second, they benefited from years of training in parish and secondary schools established by Protestant missions in Brazil. Whereas first-generation Caipira converts like Francisco Lopes and Henrique Gomes read their Bibles with difficulty and continued to speak ungrammatical variations of the Portuguese up until the end of their lives, their offspring learned and adopted the formalities of the language in Protestant schools, gradually distancing themselves from its Caipira variations. The Presbyterian folklorist and comedian, I know that the image of the Presbyterian comedian is difficult to conjure. They're so stern and serious, but we're talking about Brazil, the land and responsibilities. The Presbyterian folklorist and comedian Cornélio Pires illustrated the cultural estrangement afforded by formal schooling with an anecdote. In the story, two Caipira infants called Durvalino and Maria grew up together in the idyllic countryside and fell in love with each other. But then Maria's parents sent the girl to an elementary school in the city of São Paulo, and the boy was left disheartened. 2 years later, Durvalino paid a visit to his girlfriend, and upon arriving at the school, he encountered a different, elegant girl. Maria greeted Durvalino politely. "Oh, what a surprise! How are you doing, Durvalino? How is the family?" And Durvalino replied, "Yeah, looks so different," was all the astonished Caipira was able to say, eyes wide open, shocked. Did you come to São Paulo for a tour?" "Well, Marica, lady, I brought you some fruit." And at the end of the awkward conversation, the humiliated Caipira bade farewell and said to himself, "Goddamn school, right? Escola escambada," means literally excommunicated school. As in the anecdote, formal schooling. Oh, sorry. Yeah. As in the anecdote, Formal schooling opened a rift between the first rural converts and their increasingly educated cosmopolitan children. Third, a good number of second-generation evangelicals experienced physical, geographical dislocation, moving to the cities and villages where missionary schools had been established and where they encountered opportunities of employment that matched their new educational status. Finally, the acquisition of formal education opened new possibilities of employment for second-generation believers who found jobs in the growing cities and were able to climb the social ladder. The careers of Maria de Melo Chaves and Erasmo Braga sort of illustrate these transformations. Right? He was brought up rural area, thinly populated in Western Minas Gerais, but her father became a Protestant convert, and so he was sent to study at a prestigious Presbyterian school in the city of Lavras, which was on the other side of the state. And then he was employed in some prestigious Presbyterian Methodist schools in the growing city of Minas Gerais. And Erasmo Braga was the son of Portuguese immigrants in São Paulo, first generation converts too. He was born in the countryside of São Paulo. His father was able to be ordained. He was one of the first Presbyterian pastors in Brazil, although he was Portuguese. And Erasmo Braga too studied in missionary schools in São Paulo, what now is Mackenzie School, Mackenzie College, prestigious Presbyterian school in São Paulo, and he also found employment, some very prestigious employment in the cities of São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Niterói, the growing cities of Brazil, and Campinas too. So they all became cosmopolitan people. However, and that's where the story becomes very interesting, right? Their physical, educational, and social mobility alienated them from the social and cultural contexts in which they were raised with their parents. And for second-generation Protestants, alienation became a source of nostalgia. In the early 20th century, these second-generation believers who had been removed from their social and cultural origins set out to idealize the virtues, bravery, and strength of the first rural converts. The Reverend Herculano de Gouveia depicted early Caipira converts, such as Henrique Gomes and Francisco Lopes, as pure, unpolished gems, men of little instruction and rough manners, whose piety, rectitude, and sincerity demonstrated their religious zeal and moral reputation. In a similar way, Maria de Melo Chaves romanticized the rural congregation founded by her father and her uncle in the countryside of Minas Gerais, and portrayed this first generation of believers as humbled but honored, preach the evangelical message, and I quote her, no, not here, in a root language, though anointed by the Holy Spirit, end of quote. The idealization of Caipira converts, however, extrapolated religious boundaries and was extended to all Caipiras. So, opposing established representations of the sertanejos or backlanders as backward, Maria Chaves wrote, the man of the backlands is quick, dedicated, and smart. If our scholars, rulers, and politicians had lived there where the caboclo lives, experiencing the limitations of the environment, the lack of instruction, without assistance of any kind, neither material nor spiritual, completely abandoned, yes, if the great men who are surrounded by fame and name in the high administrative posts and in higher social spheres had experienced the same suffering, the same environment, and had the lack of instructions of the caboclo, would they be, by any chance, better than the sertanejo? I doubt it. On the moral and spiritual level, we can scarcely compare the sertanejo to the townsfolk. Apart from a few exceptions, the peasant cultivates respect for his commitments, is punctual, does not take up responsibilities beyond those he can accomplish, respects his family, and holds the social moral in high esteem. End of quote. So Turning social hierarchies upside down, Maria de Chaves portrayed the Caipiras as valuable counterpoints to the corrupted vices of urban elites. It was their isolation and lack of education that toughened their manners. Well, this idealization of Caipira virtues and rusticity coincided with the increasing interest on the part of modernist artists and regionalist historians in the old traditions and authentic culture of São Paulo. In the context of sharp demographic and economic growth, Paulista intellectual elites from the state of São Paulo promoted what modernist writers called a rediscovery of Brazil, a search for the past and rural traditions of their state that aimed at forging, the words of historian Nicolau Shevchenko, a synthesis composed of historical, modern, ethnic, tropical, national symbols that produced an ultimate impact of Brazilianness, end of quote. This artistic and historical project at times leaned towards xenophobia in the interwar era. The regionalist movement of São Paulo idealized certain aspects of their region's past, most notably the controversial figure of the bandeirantes. So the bandeirantes were mostly men of mixed Portuguese and indigenous descent who had their home base in São Paulo, and from the 17th century onwards organized long-distance expeditions to explore the Brazilian territory, enslave indigenous people, and search for precious minerals. Their profitable enslaving expeditions, along with their preference for the peaceful, Christianized indigenous communities of the Catholic missionary reductions, put the bandeirantes in a perennial conflict with the Jesuits. But whereas Catholic missionaries in the colonial era cast the bandeirantes as violent, cruel, and uncivilized, 20th century artists and scholars recast them in a positive light. So modernist artists and regionalist historians idealized the bandeirantes as proto-capitalist entrepreneurs, men of bravery and courage to serve as a glaring contrast to the darker-skinned, decadent mulattoes of the Brazilian Northeast. So this part would be heavily racialized. This was a process the historian Barbara Weinstein has called the racialization of regional differences. Scholars of bandeirante history, such as Alfredo Herres Júnior and Alcântara Machado, projected the past of São Paulo as the cradle of modern Brazil, depicting the bandeirantes as a race of giants. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when possibilities of acquiring higher education in Brazil were yet very scarce, the training of evangelical ministers in Protestant seminaries enabled some of them to take part in the national intelligentsia, what we were saying in the beginning. The seminary educated Protestant elites that emerged in this period, in the first decades of the 20th century, straddled religious and academic domains, acting as church pastors, seminary teachers, writers, linguists, and grammarians. They were very busy people. These Protestant scholars maintained an ambiguous relationship with this regionalist trend, this idealization of the bandeirantes and the caipiras. The majority of them were of these Protestant pastors, right? They were recruited from amongst the rural Protestant communities in the states of São Paulo and Minas Gerais. Their education led them into missionary schools and seminaries in larger cities, and their training to the pastorate as licensed preachers were carried out in smaller towns and villages in the countryside of Brazil. From their missionary bases, these local ministers were in charge of dozens of smaller congregations and preaching places scattered across the Brazilian countryside. To cater these far-off congregations, these ministers deployed itinerant work. In the mid-20th century, the Brazilian Presbyterian historian Julio Andrade Ferreira, in the collection of biographies of the earliest Protestant ministers of Brazil, wrote somewhat romantically that, quote, the pioneers were horsemen, so they crossed the countryside of Brazil on horse and muleback. So they made extensive journeys into the Brazilian countryside, administering sacraments to far-off congregations, opening new preaching places, places and carrying out evangelistic work. For some evangelical writers in the first decades of the 20th century, their journeys on horse and muleback into the wild interior resembled those of the 17th century bandeirantes. So in the 1940s, Maria de Melo Chaves depicted the first generations of Protestant ministers and evangelists in Western Minas Gerais as bandeirantes of the Christian faith. Self-effacing individuals who, quote, leaving the comfort and welfare of the civilized centers, thread their way through the jungles, cross the fields in search of souls for the Savior, undertaking all those losses for the love of Jesus Christ. End of quote. Indeed, Presbyterian writers such as Maria Chaves and Antonio Mota blurred the boundaries between bandeirantes and caipiras in their literary and academic work, portraying the earliest generations of Caipira converts in Minas Gerais and São Paulo as descendants of bandeirantes, and projecting the values of grit, honesty, and the Protestant ethic into the bandeirante past. But apart from this, itinerant work also familiarized Protestant evangelists and ministers with the customs, ways of life, language, and beliefs of different Caipira communities in southeastern Brazil. Presbyterian ministers demonstrated an iconoclastic attitude towards what they saw as rural and Catholic superstitions, such as the veneration of saints and the power of charms and spells to heal diseases and rid villages from insect infestation. But whereas Protestant ministers advocated Bible reading and iconoclasm as effective tools of religious cleansing, they positively sought to inscribe evangelical Christianity into the domestic intimacy of rural families. In tales and memoirs depicting life in the countryside, Presbyterian minister and linguist Antonio Mota highlighted the conversational feature of Caipira customs and sociability, in which neighbors and family members gathered around the fire in the evening to tell stories of fishing, hunting, and everyday life, some quite exaggerated, hardly credible. And Antonio Mota became the first chair of philology of the University of São Paulo after its foundation in 1934. The influential Presbyterian minister Eduardo Carlos Pereira published a series of texts of popular tracts in the 1880s that also brought this dialogical trait of Caipira domesticity and sociability to the forefront of conversion narratives, portraying the inhabitants of southern Minas Gerais and northern São Paulo, where he conducted itinerant work by their hospitable and courteous manners. Pereira's stories frequently started with an evangelist traveling through the countryside and asking to stay overnight in the houses by the road. Engaging in a friendly conversation with his hosts over dinner, the evangelist, with Bible in hand, introduced evangelical doctrines to the family. In his tracts, Pereira frequently took elements of Catholic devotions, such as the Lord's Prayer and the veneration of Mary, as starting points, arguing in a conversational style that dogmas of the Immaculate Conception of Mary and the veneration of saints were either medieval or modern invention, not primitive Christianity. Ultimately, what such tracts attempted to do was to build upon Christian images and beliefs that were already there in rural domestic devotions and recover their age-old meaning, purifying evangelical faith from what they regarded as Catholic distortions. When Pereira and Mota emerged as Brazil's leading linguists in the 20th century, they incorporated regional variations of the Portuguese language into their works of grammar and philology. And Pereira was the leading grammarian of Brazil in the first decades of the 20th century, right? As Pereira wrote in a short book of philology, the work of a grammarian was not to determine the rules of standard Portuguese, but that of observing and codifying what was spoken by the majority of the population. It was the method of the natural sciences applied to the science of language. And such work required, his own words, the observation of how both the learned classes and the common folk used a certain language, modifying it and showing its evolutionary forms. In his historical grammar that reached 96 edition, I think, up until the mid-20th century, was highly influential. Pereira affirmed that grammarians should pay close attention to historical, phonological, and morphological aspects of the language to account for its changes and adaptations over space and time. Portraying Portuguese as a living language, enriched by regional variations, incorporation of foreign expressions, and varieties in pronunciations on both sides of the Atlantic, Pereira systematized a few regional variations of the language in São Paulo and Minas Gerais. So he was really trying to systematize Caipira variations of the Portuguese languages in his grammars. His best-selling expository grammar that reached as many as 96 editions and became a standard secondary school textbook in Brazil, showed how regional variations were consequences of the evolutionary work of the language, instead of just mistakes. Pereira's grammar offered many examples of how Caipira and regional unorthodox uses of the Portuguese language in the Brazilian countryside resembled earlier modifications of popular Latin, incorporating the sounds of animal and nature into the language, or relocating the word stress in accordance to local variations. A successor of Eduardo Pereira, not only the pastoral of the independent Presbyterian Church of São Paulo, but also in his linguistic work, Reverend Antonio Mota also systematized and explained in his book, local uses and regional variations of Portuguese in his books. Mota explained in a short book, very influential, called My Language, which was adopted as a textbook in the prestigious Pedro II Secondary School of Rio de Janeiro, that Caipira adaptations of Portuguese followed long-established grammarian principles, such as the law of minimal effort and analogy. In suppressing complicated sounds in favor of easier ones, ordinary people adapted the Portuguese language and demarcated the evolution from popular Latin, archaic Portuguese, to its modern form. Mota's work as a linguist fed back into his pastoral and theological endeavors. In the new translation of the Gospel of Matthew into Portuguese, Mota applied his philological knowledge to the biblical text and linked scenes, practices, and artifacts of first century Palestine to 20th century Brazil. So throughout the new version, Mota affirmed that the clothes of northern Brazil's cowboys or vaqueiros resembled those of John the Baptist. He replaced the word rede, fishing net, by tarrafa, cast net, which was more widely used by Brazilian fishermen, and compiled a number of similarities between the customs and material world of Hebrew antiquity to our people, our land, in various passages of this translation. So to wrap up, in this presentation, I have sought to examine the complex and ambiguous religious, social, and cultural dynamics implicated in processes of religious change in Brazil. For believers, conversion was conceptualized as a recovery of the spiritual energy, zeal, and religious commitment of the early Christian church. The radical turn that gives the concept of conversion its meaning was experienced as a return to age-old religion. Whereas the Protestant repudiation of social and spiritual mediators led converts to break away from systems of co-parenthood, evangelical religion spread along networks of kin and neighborhood amidst established forms of socialization and through informal conversations in the domestic intimacy of rural families. All of these religious and cultural ambiguities enabled evangelical religion to take local color and move again through the agency of ordinary believers. With the passing of time and with the consolidation of Protestant schools and seminaries in Brazil, the evangelical relationship to culture and custom altered, incorporating the responses of different generations of believers and becoming an object of scholarly interest on the part of Protestant intellectuals. They penetrated the cultural and conceptual world of Brazilian society and linked the new religious configurations brought about by religious change to the customs and historical imagination of the country. The evangelical interest in Caipira culture is deeply enmeshed in these ambiguities, at times giving way to a fairly radical iconoclastic desire to purify religion and culture, and at times crystallizing idealized representations of Caipira customs and language. Instead of conceptualizing conversion as purely rupture, stark discontinuity with established traditions and customs, it may be useful to look at the ways in which religious change evolved amidst a dynamic of continuity and change, producing new synthesis of old and new. Thank you very much.